Hello, and welcome to the Native American Student Association's Truthsgiving presentation. Jagi Moakwe Netishis. My name is Keely Driscoll, and I am the president of the Native American Student Association for this semester. With this video presentation created by our Vice President, Hunter Wienke, and presented by myself, we hope to educate people on the true story of Thanksgiving. But before we begin, I will read to you the University of Iowa Indigenous Land Acknowledgement created by the Native American Council. The University of Iowa is located on the homelands of the Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, Bahoje, Kickapoo, Omek-Nomenewak, Miamiagi, Nutachi, Omaha, Wajaje, Jiware, Odawa, Ponca, Potawatomi, Anishinaabe, Meskwaki, Nemaha-Haki, Sakawaki, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Saanish, Nuxpaga, Nueda, and Ho-Chunk nations. The following tribal nations, Omaha, Ponca, Meskwaki, and Ho-Chunk nations, continue to thrive in the state of Iowa, and we continue to acknowledge them. As an academic institution, it is our responsibility to acknowledge the sovereignty and the traditional territories of these tribal nations and the treaties that were used to remove these tribal nations and the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this institution since 1847. Consistent with the university's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, understanding the historical and current experiences of Native peoples will help inform the work we do collectively as a university to engage in building relationships through academic scholarship, collaborative partnerships, community service, enrollment and retention efforts, acknowledging our past, our present, and future Native nations. Part 1, the first Thanksgiving. To make sure that we all understand why a presentation like this is necessary, we must first understand what the popular mythologized story of the so-called first Thanksgiving is in this country. What is the popular story of Thanksgiving? The first Thanksgiving, friendly local Native Americans saved some starving colonists in Plymouth, Massachusetts, through the help of a Native man named Squanto, who was able to speak English for some unexplained reason. And in return, the colonists invited the Native Americans to a harvest feast. The Native Americans accepted, and the two groups became strong allies through this meeting and the resulting treaty. Before getting into our corrections of this popular history, we must first center ourselves in time as well as in space. The year is 1600, and this is what the land distributions of modern-day Massachusetts looked like. As you can see, this land was inhabited by many groups of people, one of which is the Wampanoag people, and they will be the focus of this story. Now that we know where we are in time and space, we can begin to ask ourselves a few questions about the popular story of the so-called first Thanksgiving that many of us were taught in school as children. Why were the Pilgrims able to start a colony in New Plymouth? If the area was already inhabited, then how were the Pilgrims able to start a colony in the area they named New Plymouth? Who was Squanto? Why did the Pilgrims sign a treaty with the Wampanoag? What happened after? And finally, was this really the first Thanksgiving? So, why were the Pilgrims able to start a colony in New Plymouth? New Plymouth was really an already established village named Patuxet by the Wampanoag. So if Patuxet was already an established village, then what happened to the people who originally lived there? The people of Patuxet had died from an epidemic which was part of something called the Great Dying, which killed 90% of Native populations in many areas. The Great Dying, as it is called by many historians, was an event which resulted when explorers and settlers arrived from Europe and a tidal wave of diseases reduced native populations by up to 90%. As you can see from the graphic, the Great Dying occurred mostly from 1616 to 1619. The village of Patuxet was temporarily uninhabited by Wampanoag people because the majority of its residents had died from illness brought on by contact with Europeans. This is why the Pilgrims were able to start a colony in the area. Importantly, I say temporarily uninhabited because the land was still a part of the Wampanoag Nation and was only temporarily uninhabited while the nation was recovering from this massive blow to its population. The Pilgrims, as you can expect, did not think to ask the Wampanoag for permission to set up a colony in the area. Now that that question is answered, we can move on to the next question. Who was Squanto? Squanto, whose real name is Tisquantum, one of the many Wampanoag who had been kidnapped by Europeans in Patuxet in 1614 prior to the epidemic and had been sold into slavery in Spain. He eventually arrived in London before returning home, which is why he was able to speak English. When he returned home to Patuxet, he found out that his entire village had perished from disease and was taken back into the nation by the Wampanoag chief Massasoit. I bring this up because it is a highlight of the real issue with the popular story of Thanksgiving, and that is the erasure of the truths of Native history in place of lies that are meant to make people feel better about this country. I ask, don't you think that knowing Tisquantum was kidnapped and enslaved by Europeans before returning home and taking part in this story would influence people's understanding of this story? And with that, I move on to my next question. Why did the Pilgrims sign a treaty with the Wampanoag? The traditional story tells us that it was out of mutual respect and desire to live harmoniously. However, the real reason is that Pilgrims couldn't survive without the Wampanoag's help. Pilgrims had little respect for the Wampanoag and saw them as godless heathens. In their first year in what they called the New World, the Pilgrims robbed the graves of the Patuxet and stole winter supplies from surrounding native villages, as well as resorting to cannibalism just to survive. On the other hand, the Wampanoag signed the treaty so that they could focus on fighting off invading tribes to their west, which were poised to take advantage the heavily reduced Wampanoag population. Again, reduced due to disease brought by Europeans who were at this time kidnapping and enslaving them. The political reasons for agreements like this are something that exists with every treaty between nations. But I ask you to think about why these specific reasons about this specific treaty are often so left out of the telling of this story. However, before you think too much, let me tell you a little about a letter written by a man named Edward Winslow. Edward Winslow, a Puritan in attendance at the first Thanksgiving, explained in a letter to his friend in Europe that the Pilgrims did not see the Wampanoag as equals and did not invite them to the feast of 1621. The real reason why 90 Wampanoag attended the feast was because during the beginning of the celebrations, the Pilgrims fired off muskets and cannons for sport. The Wampanoag, startled by the display, were there to ensure that these actions were not those of war and stayed to be sure the Pilgrims would remain peaceful. Part 2, after the first Thanksgiving. So although people often like a happy ending for stories, and this is true for the mythologized story of the first Thanksgiving, history doesn't end. It keeps moving forward. So what happened after? Well, the next year, 1622, another ship carrying colonists arrived in the more northern village of Wessagusset, inhabited by the Massachusetts people. The Pilgrims immediately began mistreating the locals, stealing their property and perpetrating acts of violence against them. This caused the Massachusetts to conspire to retaliate against the unwelcome invaders. And learning of this plot, the leaders of New Plymouth sailed to the area and helped their countrymen massacre the village in a preemptive strike. Furthermore, the treaty between the Wampanoag and New Plymouth lasted until Massasoit's death. Afterwards, the Puritans waged war on the Wampanoag. The next sachem, or chief of the Wampanoag, a man named Menacom, also known by his English name King Philip, was beheaded by the residents of New Plymouth. His head was put on a spike and displayed for nearly 25 years. Many other Wampanoag people were also killed or enslaved by the residents of New Plymouth as well during this period. In the time between 1620 and 1640, the Great Migration, Puritans invaded and stole most of the land in this area, killing or enslaving many Native peoples in the process. Now, with this focus on the truth of historical stories in mind, one question that appears is this: was this really the first Thanksgiving? The word Thanksgiving was never used to refer to these events at the time they occurred. Instead, this connection was made in the early 19th century. However, an event did happen around that time, which was referred to as a day of Thanksgiving. This event is what historians refer to as the Pequot Massacre. In 1637, near present-day Groton, Connecticut, over 700 men, women, and children of the Pequot tribe had gathered for their annual Green Corn Festival, which happens around the same time as our current Thanksgiving Day celebrations. In the pre-dawn hours, the sleeping Pequot were surrounded by English and Dutch mercenaries who ordered them to come outside. Those who came out were shot or clubbed to death, while the terrified women and children who were huddled inside the longhouse were burned alive. The next day, the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared by law a day of thanksgiving to God because they had been successful in killing 700 unarmed men, women, and children as part of a broader Pequot War, which resulted in the genocide of the Pequot people. In the time between this massacre and the proclamation of Thanksgiving by Abraham Lincoln, the phrase "a day of Thanksgiving" was used many times by colonizers to describe the days after which their successful thefts of native land and murder of native peoples. In fact, another Thanksgiving was declared during the Pequot War after a raid against the Pequot in what is today Stamford, Connecticut. The churches of Stamford announced a second day of Thanksgiving and held a festival during which the severed heads of the murdered Pequot people were kicked around in the streets like soccer balls. So where does the modern version of Thanksgiving have its roots? Well, as I mentioned, it was proclaimed by Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln's proclamation of Thanksgiving. On the 3rd of October, 1863, Abraham Lincoln declared a national Thanksgiving Day holiday. This has since been interpreted as an attempt to try and get the North and South to get along, and is also likely the initial reason why the traditional story of Thanksgiving showcases two peoples getting along in harmony. What else happened that year? Around the same time, Abraham Lincoln personally ordered the hanging of 38 Dakota warriors who were attempting to resist colonization and were fighting in the US-Dakota War of 1862. This remains the largest mass hanging in US history. Furthermore, his administration continued the confining of Native peoples to reservations through unfair treaty negotiations. Several other massacres of Native people at the hand of the government also occurred during his presidency. Part 3, Lasting Effects. The Wampanoag today. Because the Wampanoag were not federally recognized until 2007, the tribe now has no legal claim to its ancestral land. In 2018, over 200 Mashpee Wampanoag tribal members rallied with allies and lawmakers in Washington, D.C. to voice opposition to a withdrawal of Wampanoag land from trust status. This followed a September 7th decision in which the Department of Interior formally removed land from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe's territory in eastern Massachusetts. More generally, something that I want to teach you all about is the National Day of Mourning, the counterpart to Thanksgiving. Since 1970, many Native people and non-Native allies have been participating in a National Day of Mourning instead of Thanksgiving. The National Day of Mourning is a day of remembrance of the genocide of Native people and culture that has occurred since first contact with Europeans. With everything that I have explained throughout this presentation, I will leave you with an explanation of why the way that Thanksgiving is celebrated in this country is problematic. The way that Thanksgiving is remembered and celebrated today promotes the erasure of what has happened and continues to happen to Indigenous people in this country in favor of a myth filled with demonstrable lies. A myth which has been used throughout the history of this country for political and commercial purposes that do not consider the negative effect it continues to have on Native people's visibility and empowerment. As a final note of recognition, I would like to introduce you all to Sakowis. Sakowis is the creator and founder of Truthsgiving. Sakowis is Plains Cree Saulteaux of the George Gordon First Nation in Saskatchewan, Canada, and grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. In 2015, she founded Great Plains Action Society as a way to increase Indigenous solidarity in Iowa City. It turned into a full-fledged organization during the fight against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which led her to start Little Creek Camp in February 2017. Sakowis is also a speaker, writer, and artist. She believes that environmental and social justice work are inextricably linked, and change will only happen when we dismantle corrupt colonial capitalist systems and rebuild them with a decolonized worldview. She graduated from the University of Iowa in 2008 with a master's degree in religious studies, with a focus on Native American religion and culture, and a graduate minor in American Indian Native Studies. She fights for a better future for her 2 young children. For more information, please visit truthsgiving.org as displayed above. Truthsgiving is an ideology that must be enacted through truth-telling and mutual aid to discourage colonized ideas about the Thanksgiving mythology. Not a name switch so we can keep doing the same thing. It's about telling and doing the truth on this day so we can stop dangerous stereotypes and whitewashed history from continuing to harm Indigenous lands and people, as well as Black, Latinx, Asian American, and all oppressed folks on Turtle Island. Thank you for watching this presentation. Please be sure to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, all of which will be linked in the video description below. I would also encourage you all to take this knowledge or even this presentation and share it with your family members as you celebrate time together and the harvest for this year. Thank you.